On Sunday the 25th of May, the Lytham St Anne's lifeboat crew are looking to take a group of energetic people for a walk to the wall. The walk is approximately 4.7 miles out and across the sands at St Anne's and should take around 4 hours to complete. But you may be wondering, why is there a wall 1.5 miles out across the sands in the Ribble estuary? Well, actually, there are two walls in the river, the north wall and the south wall. Construction on the walls began in 1838 and continued in phases for the next 100 years. Due to erosion and tidal forces, they continued to be maintained until around 1966. They extend out from the port of Preston for 16 miles and were designed to improve the navigation and straighten the river for vessels delivering or collecting cargoes from the original wharfs and quays at Preston. So why and how were the walls built? We know people have been using the River Ribble probably since the first canoes were built. Although the first record of a port or quay at Preston was made around 1359, we know that the Vikings used the river to establish encampments at Waltley and Ribchester. It's even said there is a famous Lancashire and England cricketer whose DNA is made up of 60% Viking and 40% Prestonian. Early sailing vessels wanting to enter the river would have to anchor in a deep stretch of water off where Southport Pier now stands, originally called the Bog Hole, and unload all or part of their cargoes into barges or lighters for onward transport to Lytham Dock or Preston Quays. In 1791, the population of Preston was thought to have been around 6,000. John Horrocks, a muslin manufacturer, moved to Preston and started to build his factories. By the end of 1798, he'd 4 factories and the population had nearly doubled. As more mills were built in Preston and the surrounding areas, the demand for raw material and coal increased. Soon the Preston merchants became dissatisfied with having to pay more and wait longer for their cargo to arrive, and they were constantly asking for improvements to be made for the safe navigation on the river. The landowners on both the north and south side of the river were constantly gaining or losing land. When the river was in full flood, great areas would be washed away, with the loss of valuable grazing land, whilst on occasions the river would change its route and transfer large areas of outmarsh to the opposite side, or worse still, leave large areas of islands where the river had split in two. In 1805 the landowners got together to promote a bill to Parliament, ostensibly to improve the navigation on the Ribble. But why would Lytham's largest landowner, Squire Clifton, want to improve the navigation up to Preston when he had his own dock at Lytham? The real reason was to reclaim their lands by fixing the river in one position. Consequently, the first Ribble Navigation Act was passed in 1806. There was very little progress made up to 1838, when the engineer Robert Stephenson advised the owners of the Ribble Navigation to begin excavating the riverbed at Preston, with the removed rock then being used to build 2 low walls on either side of the river, 350 feet apart, for a distance of 1 mile. This would then straighten and deepen the navigable channel, and was later described in many engineering textbooks as an amazing achievement. Stephenson also recommended that they purchase a new steam bucket dredger. This was used to remove the sand and gravel from the river bed, which was then loaded into barges capable of carrying 18 tons. These were then towed by the steam tug Lily to a place near to the river bank and unloaded by men using barrows, shovels and run planks. This huge undertaking being the first steps in the land reclamation project that the landowners wanted. A second dredger was soon purchased, with a further 18 larger, more advanced dredgers being purchased over the next 89 years that the port of Preston was in operation. By July of 1841, Stevenson had persuaded the directors of the Ribble Navigation Company to extend the walls down to the boundary of Hutton and Howick, increasing the land now being reclaimed. By 1847, Stevenson recommended to build a lighthouse to help guide the ships into the estuary. The first lighthouse was constructed of stone. Built in 1847, it was located 3 miles below Lytham, just off Lightburn Avenue. It was first lit in February of 1848. By 1862, the beach in front of the lighthouse was being washed away, with the lighthouse being undermined by the tide. In spite of every effort, the lighthouse fell in a severe gale on the evening of the 22nd of January, 1863. Fortunately, the lighthouse keepers had removed all the valuable equipment prior to its collapse. Trinity House then decided to build a new lighthouse 437 yards inland. The new lighthouse was lit on the 1st of January 1865 and was in use until 1890, when 2 gas-powered buoys were placed off the river entrance in a deep water anchorage known as Nelson Buoy. As the training walls were being extended seaward of Lytham, a third lighthouse was built in 1906. Designed by the Ribble engineer James Barron, it was on the north wall, located 12¼ miles from Preston docks. It was to become known as Pete's Light, after the tipping master John Peete, who lived in the lighthouse and whose job it was to ensure that the stone barges dropped their cargoes in the correct position. Fire in 1954 demolished the living accommodation, though the structure remained a focal point for ships entering the estuary up to 1981. The lighthouse finally collapsed in 1985 during a gale. By 1863, the training walls had been built 6½ miles out from Preston, west of the Naze at Freckleton. Around this time, iron ships were beginning to be built and fitted with steam engines and propellers, making them easier to navigate in narrow channels like the Ribble. With around 70 mills in Preston and the surrounding area, all requiring cargo deliveries, the first plan to build a wet dock at Preston began to be discussed. In 1882, after a successful guild year, Preston Corporation agreed to purchase the Ribble Navigation Company for £72,500, and 4 years later they began the construction of a wet dock at Preston, with all the stone dug out being used to extend the training walls. Whilst the training walls were being built, failure to mark the end of the wall would result in a fine of £20 per evening levied to the corporation. The port of Preston opened in 1892, with 885 ships using the newly opened port. The training walls were then extended 8¾ miles out from Preston, as far as Lytham Pier. This then diverts the river 3/4 mile to the south of Lytham. The Clifton estate complained strongly that the access channel up to Lytham Dock was beginning to silt up, and causing damage to his tenant farmers' crops through flooding issues. By 1910, the training walls were extended to 14 miles out into the Ribble estuary, with the new Gut Channel being opened. Over the 89 years the port of Preston was opened to commercial traffic, around 147,000 ships passed this spot inbound to Preston docks. As the walls were being built out from Preston, it was the responsibility of Preston Corporation to mark the training walls with navigation buoys and perches. These were originally lit by paraffin lanterns, which needed trimming and refilling every 3 or 4 days. They were changed over to gas lanterns in 1956, with the gas being produced in the powerhouse at Preston docks. Eventually they were replaced by solar panels and battery power around 1990, and which are still in use today. Under the 1981 Port Closure Act, Preston Corporation and North West Water were jointly responsible for the training walls from Lytham to Preston. After 15 years, the responsibility was transferred fully to North West Water, and the walls from Lytham to sea were left to decay. Preston City Council are still responsible for marking the position of the walls from Preston to sea, along with any navigational hazards that may arise. When the Port of Preston closed to commercial traffic, there were 66 navigation markers and buoys in the river. Today, around 30 remain, with only 16 of these now lit. The maintenance is carried out by Preston Council staff, or put out to tender to outside contractors. The last major replacement of a navigation mark took place in 1998 by Chris Miller of Preston Marine Services, with the assistance of a helicopter and a cost of £45,000. Since 1839, over 10,000 acres of land have been reclaimed along the Ribble. It was not all gains, however. As a result of the construction of the training walls, it was felt that Southport lost its deep water anchorage known as the Bog Hole, located just off where Southport Pier now stands, while similarly St Anne's lost its deep water channel known as the North Hollow, resulting in the loss of its fishing industry and first lifeboat station. And, of course, we know that Lytham eventually lost its golden sands.